of these products. The second, which I think is a controversial issue, is quality. What is the role of these trade organizations, these facilitation organizations, in quality? Because when you go to the base of the pyramid, a lot of these consumers are first-time consumers. So it is not simply that if they have a bad experience with your product, they'll move on to another product. We found with, for example, solar lights, if you have a bad experience with a solar light, you stop buying solar lights. And that is a real issue. So you can have trade facilitation where you're actually facilitating both a quality manufacturer and a poor quality manufacturer. And the poor quality manufacturer is actually killing your export market. Because when you especially go to the base of the pyramid, it is actually a very quality sensitive market, not just price sensitive. The third thing, which perhaps has been less mentioned, is the distribution issue. So if we are going to do a lot more South-South trade, how do we solve the real big issue of actually reaching the customer? The OECD has shown that every time you increase the distance by 10%, trade goes down by 17% when it's South-South. If you do that for North-South trade, you find that the ratio is much lower. So it really becomes very expensive to reach the last mile. So what is the role of trade organizations to help in creating partnerships, whether it's through NGOs or local organizations, to actually reach that last mile? And I think these are some of the more interesting things that come out once we start to see a more South-South trade, because it's not just about selling into the emerging middle classes, which, by the way, are totally overestimated in most cases. So
Thanks, Gaurav. Brian, I'm going to ask you to take that question. Before you take it, is there anyone else who would like to comment on how TSIs have supported their experience? Go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you, Mrs. Moderator. I'd just like to share the experience that we had in Jamaica post the crisis. We responded, well, the government, not the TSIs, but the government using some of the TSIs responded, I think in December 2008, to put in place a mix of fiscal measures and credit measures, mainly to support two of the sectors in our economy, tourism and manufacturing. And we had mixed success. With respect to the credit measures, we put in place a loan package, which was available mainly for small and medium-sized enterprises at really reduced interest rates. And we got a lot of complaints that when the SMEs went to the financial institutions which were charged with disbursing these loans, many of them didn't have the business plans that the banks were looking for. They didn't have up-to-date accounting statistics. And the figure that I saw a couple months after we implemented it is that of 400 loan applications, only 25 were approved. The second one, which was more on the fiscal side, is that we reduced the value-added tax for the tourism sector by 50% for 6 months. And I was interested, Mrs. Bell, when you opened with that question about what measures have TSIs taken to adapt to the crisis. I was thinking that I was going to hear that these measures were akin to short-term stimulus packages, in which event, once the external shock situation had passed, then they would have been withdrawn. So I was heartened to hear, certainly in terms of what Uganda is doing, that what they did wasn't short-term. They actually beefed up their training, technical assistance. There are some strategic responses that I think are permanent, so you're not going to withdraw them after a while. But Mr. Mitchell spoke about incentivizing complacent exporters, and it just seemed to me that maybe some of the TSIs were complacent themselves, because all of this focus that is being made now on finding new markets, looking at the domestic market, finding new strategic products, maybe this is something that was good for you. You needed to think more creatively about how you serve your clients, and maybe it's a good thing that you now have a broader focus going forward.
Thank you for those comments, Brian. Maybe also in responding to speak to any opportunities that came out of this crisis for Canada.
Well, let me first comment on the South-South side, which is a little outside of our sphere, because we do have a specific focus on helping companies sell into Canada. But it's been for some time working with partners, and I'm thinking back a couple of years ago with the Department of Trade and Industry in South Africa, that there has been this discussion of import promotion organizations in the South. Because clearly that's where the market growth opportunities are. We've heard that now from a number of speakers, including this panel. But these are investments that are required. There's sometimes political challenges, but I've been encouraged to hear some of the efforts that the CCPIT has undertaken to actually undertake import promotion. But I do think there is a space for the international community, the donor community, organizations like ITC, to assist in creating those type of facilities in some of these key emerging markets, such as Brazil, in China, and India, and actually encourage that type of South-South trade and overcome some of those obstacles that are evident in the comparison of South-South trade and South-North trade when you look at the distance. The other gap that has come more clearly in I think the earlier sessions on South-South trade is the need for investment in infrastructure. That is another large gap, and again a place for the donor community and international assistance to supplement and incent private sector efforts and domestic government efforts to address those challenges. I don't have a response, but I was very interested to hear the comment about quality and that the specific challenge that selling to the bottom of the pyramid, the base of the pyramid, as it's often termed, that the unique challenge of sort of single consumer experience with poor quality can have on long-term consumer behavior. And clearly that indicates that as the trend is for TSIs is to look at South-South trade, that there is a need to look at the quality of the manufacturing, the selection of companies based on quality standards, and recognize that some of the requirements that exist in selling into northern markets of very high standards, their absence doesn't mean that it should become a free-for-all, and that there's a need to, in a way, supplement the lack of official standards or retailer-driven standards in the South with efforts by the TSIs to ensure that the quality doesn't degrade to the point that it undermines export efforts in the long term.
Thanks, Brian. It really raises an interesting point because traditionally TSIs have focused in assisting clients in developing their export potential and being able to meet the market access requirements in North markets, quote unquote. But really and truly, as we realize that South trade is developing, there may be a greater role that TSIs must play in preparing their companies, in looking at those markets and preparing them for entrance into those markets. But I know Ricardo had a comment. Ricardo? Okay.
Thank you. Well, in our case, I think that there were different situations because, for example, the banana sector and the cocoa sector, they grew in the crisis. No problem. Shrimp sector, volume-wise, it grew. Price-wise, it went down for about 20-25%. In fisheries, again, the same thing. So maybe in our case, the main problem is that our export-related products are mainly commodities in the market, so they were affected differently. Now, what did we do? We tried to increase the number of trade missions, trade show participations, but again, that helped 10, 20, 100 companies, but when you look at it, nation exports didn't really make a big impact. So I think that to make an impact in that sense is not only the work of the TSI, but the work of the government with all the TSIs in the country. Because you were talking a few minutes ago about $100 million invested in Africa, Chongqing, then lines of credit